Hey, this is Jordan with RoboJojo, and today we're making this cool looking 3D light installation with Cinema4d and Redshift. Let's get to it. So to tackle making this scene, first thing we're going to do is create the light tube. To do that, we'll simply add a cube to the scene, and we're going to make it a 7 by 400 by 7 cube. We're going to add a fillet to it, and we're going to make it 1 centimeter. And subdivision of 3 is fine. And before we move forward, we're going to rename the cube to light tube. Next, we're going to create a material to apply to the light. So we're going to go to materials, create, redshift, material, material, and we're going to rename the material light tube. And we're going to apply it to our light tube cube. Next, we'll open our material, open our shader graph. I already have my shader graph open, and we're going to go ahead and start the render view so we can see our tube and what we're doing as we change the material. And in our shader graph, we're going to bring in a material. So I'm going to search for mat. So we're going to bring in a second material node and a material blender, because what we're going to be doing is in the middle of the tube, we want that to be light emitting, and towards the end of the tube, we want that to be dark or darker than the middle. For our first material, that's going to be our emitting material. So we go to overall emission weight, and I'm going to set that to 3. And I'm going to set the emission color to a light blue color. And about 50% saturation. Now you'll notice here in the render view that it doesn't really look like it's emitting much of any light. It just looks like a flat shape. The reason for this is that the emission has nothing to reflect off, like a redshift environment or a volume or a VDB or what have you. While we could add those things to the scene, the easiest thing to do is to add a bloom effect. And we can do that in our render view. Click the side arrows here, click the settings, and add bloom. Let's open up our settings for bloom. We're going to increase the bloom intensity, increase the softness. And we're going to adjust the bloom threshold until it looks like it's an emitting light. And that's about right there. Close our settings. And now you can see it looks like it's more of a light emitting tube. But to make it a little more interesting, we're going to make the ends darker than the middle. To do that, we're going to create our dark material. So in our second material node, we're going to go to base properties, and we're going to change the preset to tinted glass. And we're going to change the transmittance color down in the subsurface section to black. And that will serve to be our dark ends. So now we have our 2 materials. Let's feed the emissive material as our base material into the material blender. And let's feed our darker material, our glass, into layer 1 of our material blender. If you route the material blender out to the output, all you see is the emissive material because there's no blending layer telling the renderer to show any of layer color 1. So to do this, we're going to use a ramp. Bring in our ramp node. Feed that into our material blender, layer color 1, blend color. Now you notice that the top of the tube is now darkened. However, the bottom of the tube is still light. So what we need to do is to have in our ramp, black in the middle, add another knot towards the beginning of the ramp, and change the color of that knot to white. And now we have dark ends on each side of our tube. If we want, we can control how much of the tube is the emissive portion by adding 2 more knots. Here are about 25 and 75% positions, and changing those knot colors to black. So now more of the tube is being emissive, and it's just the ends that are darker. So now we have our basic light tube. To recreate the scene that you saw at the beginning, I'm going to show you 2 different ways to use the light tube. In the first way, we're simply going to use a cloner. So let's go to cloner. Let's go up to our menu, add a cloner to the scene, and put the light tube inside the cloner. And then I'm going to first change the name of this cloner to ceiling lights. I'm going to change the mode to linear. I'm going to change the count to 20. And I'm going to clone along the z-axis with about 50 centimeters in between each of the clones. Next, I'm going to make sure my cloner is selected, and I'm going to add a formula effector. And in the parameter tab of the formula effector, I'm going to uncheck scale because we don't need it. And before I adjust the position, I'm going to come to the top view in my scene, zoom out so we can see the whole thing. And I'm going to increase the X value so you can see what's happening. As I increase the X value, a sine curve becomes more obvious. In this case, it's about 160, I'm going to call it 170 centimeters. Come back to my perspective view. And before we move forward, I have to show you a little bit of a gotcha. The formula effector doesn't just change the position, it also changes the position over time. If I stop my render view and hit play on the timeline, you notice that the formula effector is changing the position of the light tubes over time. And this isn't what we want in this case. So I'm going to hit stop, go back to the beginning of my timeline, select the formula effector, and go to effector tab. And in the formula, I'm just going to delete the t variable and the plus sign so that time should no longer affect the formula. And I'll hit play, and the formula effector is no longer changing the position over time. Now we have our ceiling lights, but we don't have a room for the lights to actually reflect in. So let's go ahead and create that. In order to create our room, we're going to add a cube to the scene. And we're going to change the dimensions of the cube to 1000 by 1000 by 2000. I'm going to zoom out here so I can see my room. Now it's a little bit boring just to have a straight cube, so what we're going to do is we're going to first make the cube editable by selecting it and hitting C. And then we'll go to polygon mode, select the top face, delete, and we'll also delete the front face as well. This will allow us to add more light to the scene later. Now to make the room more interesting, we're going to hit MK for the line cut tool. And let's go into our top view. Zoom out so we can see our entire room. We're going to hold down Shift, start at the top, and about a third of the way across the room, we're going to click and make a cut down. And while we're still holding Shift, we're going to go over to the right, about 2/3 of the way across the room. Click again. Go up, click again. And then go to the beginning. And click again. And then we let go of Shift. Now we can come back into our perspective view. Hit E to select our axis tool. Click the middle polygon that we've created, and we're going to hit MT for the extrude tool. Click and drag so we make a depression in the middle of the room. That's about enough there. The offset ended up being about 90 to 100. And this extrusion created an extra polygon in the front here that we don't want. So I'm going to go to my axis tool again, select it, that polygon, and delete it. And one last thing with our room before we move forward, you'll notice that in our scene, these edges are perfectly sharp, which is not realistic. So in order to fix that, we're going to add a Bevel Deformer to our cube, which I should rename to room to make it clear what it is. So we're going to go up to our Deformer menu, add Bevel, and make it a child of the room. And in our offset, we're going to make it 2 centimeters with a subdivision of 3. And it's a subtle change, but it will make a big difference visually later when we actually light the room. Next, we're going to add a camera to the scene so we can start building towards the camera and making sure that everything is placed exactly where we want it. So I'm going to go to Redshift, Cameras, Standard. And I'm going to rename the camera to Cam, just for short. And I'm going to look for the camera. And basically what I want to try to do is position the camera so it's fairly close to the floor, but it's looking at an angle that's more or less parallel to the floor. This is pretty close. Let's check the side view to see what we have. And this is about right. We're pretty low to the floor. This is about where we want to be. And the camera view is more or less parallel with the bottom of the floor. I do want to move the camera closer into the room. And while here, I'm also going to move the ceiling lights further away from the back wall. And let's actually go to the top view real quick. And I'm going to change the camera's rotation to look a little bit more towards the middle of the room. And position it a little bit more towards the middle as well. Now in our perspective view, we can see through looking through our camera that our ceiling lights are not entirely visible within the frame, but we can fix that without moving the camera. So before I move any further, just so we don't move the camera by accident, I'm going to right click the camera, go to rigging tags, go to protection tag, and this protection tag will keep us from moving the camera by accident. If I click and drag, it will not allow us to move the camera. In order to actually move around the scene, I'm going to have to click out of the camera view. So I'm going to click out of the camera, and I'm actually going to come to the side view. And we kind of see our problem here is that if we were to point the camera up, we would notice that there wasn't any actual ceiling that the ceiling lights were attached to. So we don't want to do that. What we're going to do instead is to kind of cheat and have the lights angled in such a way that they sort of come down into the camera view. And in order to do that, we're going to click our ceiling lights, and we're going to go to our effectors and add a step effector. We're going to come to the parameter tab, uncheck scale because we don't need that. Check position, and we're going to increase the Y position. And what we're trying to do is basically get the angle at which these cloners are arranged to match the angle of the camera itself. And actually, before I go any further, I want to go back to my camera and go back to my camera view in perspective. And I'm actually going to change the camera to a wide angle 25mm, just so we can see more of our scene. I'm going to click out of the camera and come back to my side view and readjust that again. See how that changed the angle of our camera, so that's a pretty important step to remember. So I'll go back to my step effector, increase the Y again so the angle matches. And then we're going to move the entire cloner down into the scene so we can see more of the lights. And I'll come back to my perspective view and click into the camera. And that's about what you want. You want the front light to basically come into the middle of the frame. I'm going to move my effectors that are affecting those ceiling lights, the ceiling lights cloner next to the ceiling lights. And for right now, that's what we're going to do with the ceiling lights. So to kind of see what we have so far, let's go back to our render view and activate it. And then we'll go to render camera. Just make sure we're looking for the camera view, and that's what we have so far. Now that's one way to utilize the light tubes that we've created. The next way is to apply the light tubes to the edges of geometry. And to show you a simple example, first add a cube to the scene. And we're going to click out of the camera, move the cube down into the scene so we can see a little bit better. Hit C to make the cube editable. We're going to click and drag the ceiling lights to make a copy of them. We're going to rename the copied cloner to cube lights. In the effectors tab of the cube lights cloner, we're going to delete the effectors because we don't need them for the cube lights. And we're going to change the mode of the cube lights to object. And we're going to feed our cube geometry into the object parameter. We're going to change our distribution to edge, and we're going to activate scale on edge and change the scale on edge to 90%. If we zoom in on our cube, we can kind of see what we're getting is our light cubes on the edges of the cube geometry. If we come back to our render view and activate it, we have our light tube along the edges of the cube, but there are a couple of problems with this. One, we can still see our cube in the render view. In order to solve this problem, it's pretty simple. All we have to do is come to our stop lights and make the bottom one red to keep it out of the render view. But the other problem is we don't have anything actually connecting these light tubes to each other. There are a couple different ways to do this. We could use an atom array to make the rigging, but I'm going to show you a less conventional way utilizing some Redshift tools. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the cube in my scene, switch to edge mode, hit Control A to select all edges of the cube, and go to Mesh, and then go to Mesh, Conversion, Edge to Spline. And what this is going to do is in our object list, you see that a spline has now been created as a child of the cube. The spline is created using the edges. What we're going to do is use this spline to create the rigging in Redshift. In order for this to work, we're going to have to add a tag to the spline first. Otherwise, it won't render. So we're going to right-click the spline, go to Redshift Tags, Redshift Object, and then under the Curve tab, we're going to go to Mode and go and say Cylinders. Now, right now, it's too small to be able to see it, so we're going to increase the thickness to about 4. And you'll notice it's still not showing up in the render, and that's because we've made it a child of something that we were hiding in the render, which is the cube. Two solutions. One, we could take the spline and not have it be a child of the cube, but whenever I move the cube, I'd like the spline to follow. So to solve this issue, select the cube spline and change the stoplight to green for the renderer. It now shows the spline in the renderer, which is going to act as our rigging. And I'll zoom in to show you more in the render view. And 4 is about the right size. So the next thing we're going to do is create a material for the rigging. So we're going to go to Materials, Create, Redshift, Material, and we're going to name it Rigging. And we're going to apply it to our spline. And over in our shader view, I'm going to select the material and change the diffuse color to a 10% gray, so it's very dark. And we're going to change the reflection roughness to 0.5, so it's pretty rough. This gives us a fairly dark material in our render view. Now, you might notice that there's a bit of an issue here with our light tube. The top and bottom of the light tube have a face that still has the emissive material on it, which doesn't look great. So in order to fix this, I'm going to stop my render view. And for my cube lights, I'm going to disable the cloner, zoom back out, select my light tube under the cube lights, and move it over to make sure I have the right one. Zoom back in, zoom back in, and I'm going to come over to polygon mode, and I'm going to hit my display. I'm actually going to change the display grad shading lines so I can see my geometry better. I'm going to make the light tube editable by hitting C, and I'm going to select the top face, go down to the bottom, hit Shift, select the bottom face, and it's kind of a double check to make sure you have both selected. You can see that the axis tool is in the middle of the light tube, so that means you have both selected. So we can go up to Select, Store Selection, and we're going to name this selection Top and Bottom, just to be descriptive. Next, we're going to apply the rigging to our light tube. And in the selection, under the Tag tab, we're going to drag our selection in. We're going to re-enable our cloner, Cube Lights cloner, and zoom back in on our cube on the corner and see if what we've done is made a change. We'll start render view again. And you'll notice that's now solved our issue. Now if you come back to our full camera view, you can see what we've created, a cool looking light cube. I'm just going to rotate it here a little bit to show you, kind of show it off. Now, it's important to remember that this same method can be used for any geometry, whether that's another primitive like a pyramid or a platonic solid or what have you. And it can also be used with low poly models like low poly animals, landscapes. And it can also be used with sweeps quite effectively, as I did in this piece that you're seeing right now. Now, before going any further, there's one gotcha that you have to worry about with this setup. Whenever you want to move whatever geometry that you've applied the light tubes to, you always want to move the geometry itself and never the cloner. If you move the cloner, in this case the Cube Lights cloner, and you rotate it, I'll show you what can happen. You'll notice that the lights now extend far beyond the edges, which is probably not what we want. So to reiterate, always move the geo and rotate the geometry. If we rotate the cube, we don't have any such problems, as you can see here. I'll undo that. Now what I'm going to do is use the same methods that I used before, and I'm going to add more cubes and possibly some random tube lights around the scene. I'm going to fast forward for this part, but just know that I'm using the same methods that I've already covered. Okay, so now that we've scattered some light structures around the scene, we're going to make the room look a little bit better by adding material to it. So let's go to Create, Redshift, Material, Material. We're going to rename it to Dark. And we're going to add it to our room geometry. In our shader graph, what we're going to do is we're going to create a dark material that has some texture to it, so it'll make the reflections more interesting to look at. So in our material node, let's go to diffuse and make that a 10% gray to make it quite dark. And we're going to add texture procedurally. Let's add a max on noise node. And while we're searching, we're also going to add a color layer node because we're going to layer on a few different noises to add different levels of detail. So in our first max on noise, we're going to select Cell Voronoi, and we're going to change the scale to 10. And let's actually route it out to the output so we can kind of see what's happening. So you see we're getting more of like a crystalline sort of structure in our texture. And I'm just going to increase the low clip and the high clip just to make it a little bit more contrasty. And we're going to make that the base layer of our color layer. Now I'm going to click and drag on the noise to make a copy. And for the second noise, I'm going to route it out to the output. And I'm going to change the noise type to a displaced turbulence. And we're going to change the scale to 2. And route that noise into our color layer 1. Again, we're going to control click or control drag our noise to make another copy. And for this noise, we're going to route it out again. We're going to change the noise type to Booyah. And we're going to change the scale to 0.5. So we have a level of very fine detail. And we're going to route that into our color layer 2. Next, we're going to route our color layer to the output so we can see what we're doing. We're going to enable color layer 2. And for color layer 1, we're going to change the mode to multiply. And we're going to change the blend mode for color layer 2 to average. This is the basic texture that we've built. Before we move on, we're going to add a ramp node. And we're going to route our color layer into that ramp node to give us more control over the contrast. We're going to route into our material node, reflection roughness, and we're going to route our material node to our output. Now, since we're making kind of fine adjustments to the look of the room, I'm going to maximize my render view so we can get a better look. So this is a little bit shinier than I wanted. So what I'm going to do is minimize my render view. And in my ramp, in order to make it less shiny, I want less darkness in the texture. So I'm going to route my RS ramp to the output. And I'm going to select the middle knot, and I'm going to drag it more towards the black side to make it brighter overall. And I'm also going to change the black to more of a 10% black. So let's route the material out again. I'm going to maximize my render view. And that's about what I want in our reflections, just something to add more complexity and interest. The back wall might be too lit, but we haven't added proper lighting to the scene yet, so I'm not too worried about that. I'll minimize my render view. And while we're talking about light, let's go ahead and add actual lighting to the scene. So I'm going to stop my render view. And I'm going to go to Redshift, Lights, Area Light. And we're going to come out of the camera view so I can adjust the positioning of the light. Drag it up here above the room. Rotate it so it's pointing down at the floor. Or maybe even more, a little bit more towards the back wall. Maybe something like 80 degrees is good. Drag up again so it's above the room. And we're going to come into our general tab for our light and change the size X to 1000 and our size Y to 2000. Now I'm going to drag it up again a little bit more, and we're going to restart our render view, lock it to the camera view, and you'll see that it's much too bright. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back to our general tab and decrease the exposure. -4 should be pretty good. And that works pretty well. So now we have a general illumination over the room while still having bright spots with the light tubes, which is basically the look that we're going for. At this point, you can also add some extra geometry to the room. In the original piece that you saw at the beginning, I added some columns that were implied to be hanging from the ceiling. Just very quickly, all I did with that was add a cube to the scene and adjusted it so that the size was about 100 in the X, 100 in the Z, and about 300 in the Y. Although we might adjust that a little bit more. Come back into my scene view. Yeah, we're actually going to increase the size of that so we can get into our camera view. And I'm just going to place it within my scene. So you see how it's kind of hanging. Let's add a fillet to the column to make it a little bit more realistic. So we'll add a fillet, and we'll do the same fillet we did earlier, about 2 centimeters. And I'm just going to position this cube so it's more over the side of the room. I'm going to duplicate it a few times so that it's on each side of the room. So we have 3 on each side of the room. And I'm going to move my room geometry up in my object list next to the cubes so I can select all the cubes and the room, hit Alt-G to group them in a null, and we're going to rename the null room structure. And I'm going to apply the dark material to that room structure null, so all of my columns are also utilizing the material that we created. And the very last thing we're going to do is animate the ceiling lights. So in order to do that, we're going to select our ceiling lights cloner, come up to Effector, Plane Effector. I'm going to move it down so it's closer to the ceiling lights cloner. And we're going to come to our parameter tab, uncheck position, and go to fall off and create a linear field. We're going to set the direction to +Z. And I'm going to just come to my top view so I can see which lights the linear field is affecting. I'm going to make sure that in my parameter tab that the field's color is selected in color mode. And then I'm going to select my linear field, and I'm going to come to the color remap tab and change it from color to gradient. And I'm going to drag the white knot to the middle. I'm going to create another knot and make it black at the beginning, at the other end of the gradient. In the middle, I'm going to change the white color from white to a light blue to kind of match the light blue that we used for the other light tubes. And I'm going to make it about 50% saturation because that's what tends to work best with any emissive material. Now, if you move the linear field through your lights, you notice that nothing happens in your render view. And that's because we actually have to still set up the material in order to accept the Mograph data from the field. So we'll come back to our materials, and we're going to make a copy of our light tube material because we don't want to affect the original. And we're going to rename this new material ceiling light. And over in our shader graph, we're going to search for a color user data node, add that. In the attribute name dropdown, we're going to select Mograph color, and what you should see is RSMG color, short for Redshift Mograph color. We're going to route that color data into our emissive material and go to overall emission color. So now when we move our linear field, we should be able to see the lights animate. And I actually forgot one thing before doing anything else. We want to make sure that we apply our new ceiling lights material to our ceiling lights light tubes. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Now you'll notice that our ceiling lights have gone out in the render view. And if I drag my linear field through the lights, now we get the animation that we're looking for. So there's a lot of steps there and a lot of things that can be missed. So just make sure that if something's not working for you, go back, rewatch this last section of the video so you can see what's not working. But basically what's happening here is that if we come back to our linear field color remap tab, you'll notice that we put black at the beginning and end of the gradient color remap. And what this does is it feeds black into the beginning and end of the linear field. So at the beginning of the linear field, we're feeding the color data of black, and at the end of the field, we're feeding color data of black. So, and in the middle, we're feeding blue. So as we drag the linear field through, it looks like the lights are turning on and off. Now, if you want the lights to be more of a rainbow color, like you saw in the example at the beginning, what you can do is go to linear field color remap and load a different preset, and we're going to use heat 2. To get this to work, we're also going to need to add black knots at the beginning and end, just like last time. And I also like to take out the dark blue color because dark colors don't work as well with emissive materials. And I'm also going to click each color in the gradient, and I'm going to adjust the saturation to about 50%. Doesn't have to be exact, but 50% is just going to look a little bit better. And I'm also going to move the colors to be a little bit more evenly distributed. As we drag through our linear field, you can see that the rainbow colors are there. Pretty cool looking. Now to complete the scene, all that would be left to do would be to animate the linear field. So we're going to go to linear field and select the coordinates. Make sure our linear field starts in front of the lights and that we're at frame 0 on our animation, on our timeline. Click the circle next to the Z position to create a keyframe there. Go to the last frame in our timeline. Drag the linear field to the end, to the back of the room, all the way through the lights, and click the keyframe again. That's very important. And then if you hit play, you can see that we got our animation working. So that's it for this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please consider pressing the like button and subscribing for more tutorials in the future. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you make something cool using this tutorial, consider posting it to Twitter with the hashtag RoboJojo. Thanks for watching this tutorial and stay tuned for the next one. See you then.